Hi, everyone. So we're here today to talk about digital literacy, which is really about developing our skills for reading and interpreting the digital world around us. And increasingly, our lives are becoming data. They're being processed by algorithms. Sensors and computing cycles are turning our activities and our behaviors into data. So the most basic unit of data, of the digital, is rendered as ones and zeros. But it's not actually human legible. This is how computers read data. So the way we encounter most of the algorithms and the data in our everyday lives is actually quite similar. It's both obscure. So the idea behind this session, digital literacy, implies a certain kind of comprehension. But what is digital literacy if we don't really see the data? Does anyone here recognize what this is? Nobody? So translated from binary, these ones and zeros are the most fundamental elements of human literacy, the alphabet. So I had to run these through a processor to actually turn them into something that's human legible, like the alphabet. So maybe a few of you here recognize it, probably not. But even those who code for a living don't spend a lot of time parsing the ones and zeros so close to the metal. So people often say, I have nothing to hide. And I'm afraid that's actually because we're not familiar enough with the ways data is being used around us. Technology is digitally codifying our behaviors for those who have the power to collect and to process the data. And that's often leaving us in this dark, outside the black box. So in order to work towards digital literacy today, I want to argue that data needs to actually be made clear enough for us to read first. We need to learn our digital ABCs before we can move on to the words and phrases and complex stories. Only then can we work on developing digital literacies to understand what the data is telling us and how others see us. So today I'm going to walk through how internet platforms, browsing plugins, and individual people are making data and algorithms more legible for human readability. As this session is intended to be really grounded and practical, I've put together a bunch of resources and links, which you can find at bit.ly/legibledata, all lowercase. So platforms, the places that consolidate all of our data, actually have the most power over our digital experiences. Some of them have actually begun to acknowledge their responsibility to consumers by introducing new transparency tools. Google, Facebook, and even data brokers like Axiom have recently developed dashboards that reflect back to us the data that they have collected about our behaviors and interests. So Google offers a detailed list of all the things it thinks we might be interested in based on our browser and search history. So we can take a look back by going to the Google Ads settings page in our profile. When I looked at my own profile recently, I saw that Google thought I was interested in home furnishings. And because I'm not in the market for buying a new couch, I opted to remove it from my profile. So of course, keeping track of these settings is really time-consuming for consumers and for the average user. But at least Google is offering us the opportunity to explore what our accumulated online habits actually say about us. So this past summer, Facebook actually introduced a new interactive feature that allows us to click on any ad in our feed. So I have the option to tell Facebook that I don't want to see a particular ad, but more importantly, it also gives me an explanation as to why they think that profile information might lead to this kind of ad. So in this example, an ad for home theater equipment is targeted to people who express interest in certain television shows on Facebook. So Facebook is actually taking important steps to draw a direct line between the types of ads that we see and the personal data that on which the ads are based. So Facebook is also reminding us that this is only one of the reasons that we get to see the ad, and this explanation actually risks oversimplifying the complexity that actually goes on behind any given ad. Now, this is Axiom. Has anyone heard of Axiom before? No. So Axiom is one of the largest data broker companies that you may not know of. They are aggregating information from our online behaviors, surveys, and even public records. And they've actually responded to our consumer protection concerns about the data that they're developing, the databases that they're developing, by giving us a personal portal view into our data profiles. So aboutthedata.com shows us everything from our household purchasing history to education information and inferred marital status. So when I looked at my own profile, for some reason they associated me with my parents' driving records. So they thought I was interested in buying a truck soon. So I have the opportunity to correct that information through this portal. But aboutthedata.com isn't really telling me how Axiom classifies me when it bundles me with other consumers to sell me to potential advertisers. I don't know how that truck detail affects my consumer segmentation. So I certainly don't get to see how Axiom's data broker customers intend to use my data, those third parties that are interested in purchasing the data. So there's no link to the larger ecosystem of data brokers to follow where my data trail ends up. So each of these internet platforms for data has actually taken very important steps towards making more of our data transparent and making it at least partially legible to us. But in each of these cases, the data that they provide is only a partial view. We get to see what the data is, but not necessarily how it's being used. So we're also confronted with this strange catch-22. We're invited to correct for faulty assumptions or correlations by changing our profiles and updating the details to more relevantly reflect our intentions. But that also requires offering up more data to these companies. So before I'm convinced of doing any of that, I think we need more assurances about how the data is actually going to be used. And I want to be able to follow the impacts of those alterations that I make. So going beyond what internet companies are telling us about our data profiles, some developers and researchers have started to build tools and simple interfaces that are making data more legible for us. Sometimes all it takes is installing a simple browser plugin or granting API access to an application that can make this hidden data more visible to us. So these are some of the best tools we have as users to begin to kind of see our data in the same way that companies and third parties and even governments might see our data. So after the Snowden revelations this past couple of years introduced us all to the concept of metadata, we started to wonder how much meaning could actually be uncovered from this information about our communications habits. So a group of MIT researchers released their tool Immersion, which taps into our email metadata from Gmail and a couple other providers. And these interactive visualizations allow us to examine our network and the personal timeline. So when I explored my own history, Immersion resurfaced a forgotten network of old roommates. And I was reminded of the importance of the kind of history of people as I changed jobs and moved cities over time. And so seeing so much of my own personal narrative in my metadata in this interactive experience really made it clear how important and how meaningful all of this metadata might be to someone else who was interested in looking at it. So each time we visit a website, cookies are dropped in our browser that report back our activity to advertisers and other data broker networks. So Ghostery is another plugin that shows us how many third parties are actually listening in when a website loads. So in this example, cookies from 7 different companies were dropped just by visiting the front page of the New York Times. So this plugin takes what's hidden behind the browser and makes it visible. Ghostery allows us to start questioning the business practices of these companies like Scorecard and Web Trends by introducing them to us. We may not have seen them otherwise. So every time a page loads, we're reminded and made conscious of the fact that we're in this part of this broader data ecosystem. And these cookies, of course, follow us everywhere we go on the web, and they're part of this larger network. So Collusion is another large browser plugin that displays the connections between the websites and the third parties that are listening in. So the red nodes are the websites, and all the black nodes are these data brokers connecting to each other. And so by mapping out your network as you're browsing through your websites, we get to actually see the data about where our behaviors are intersecting and possibly influencing each other as we crawl the web. So with each of these plugins, I still have to trust that their creators won't misuse my data after I've granted them access. We get to learn from making our data legible in new ways, but we're also introducing a new point of exposure of our digital activities. So we don't always need special tools like plugins to be able to start to experiment with our digital environments. We can actually start by manipulating the inputs and watching the outputs of our data. So I like to think of these as personal database interventions. These are small-scale experiments that expose the seams of the algorithm. So at the more advanced level of the spectrum, some researchers and journalists are pulling kind of stunts with their personal data. And in the process, they're teaching us how to critically interrogate the system for ourselves. So are we human readable or machine readable? Most of our friends know who we are on Facebook, so that's actually an easy place to play with sneaky ways of throwing off advertisers off my scent by introducing false information to my digital profiles. So think of this as a digital version of the game of two truths and a lie. I've seen friends declare themselves the opposite sex, or they're visiting random websites that don't quite match their hobbies, and they plant humorous interests in their Facebook profiles to see how these planted data points might affect their feeds and their ads. And I think it's actually easier to kind of catch these things and how they're affected the algorithms in the feed because that's something that's false is grabbing our attention more than things that would naturally kind of occur and subtly match our more authentic history and behavior. But it's still really kind of hard to know what the harms might be in playing around with our data profiles in the long term. So Matt Honan, a writer for Wired, recently took his Facebook experimentation a step further. Whoops. I think I've lost my slides. So Matt Honan, just one second. Technical difficulties. There we go. So he took his experimentation a step further. He wanted to see what would happen if he liked literally everything that came through his Facebook feed for a 48-hour period. And he wrote, after checking in and liking a bunch of stuff over the course of an hour, there were no more human beings in my feed anymore. And so when his friends started to message him worried that his account had been hacked, he also realized how much the network impacts of his activity was on his friends' feeds. So Honan's experiment essentially broke the algorithm, rendering Facebook almost unusable. And this scale of intervention, of course, isn't practical for most of us to try out. But it's a stunt. But it does teach us something about how we can play around with our data and be more conscious of our inputs and our outputs and deciding what we choose to like and what we don't like and how that affects our feeds later on. So another example is knowing how important key life events are to advertisers. Jennifer Tazie wanted to see if she could successfully hide her pregnancy from the internet. So in a talk at Theorizing the Web this spring, she detailed her efforts to mask any behavior that suggested that some big event was coming to change her life. So she used everything from Tor to mask her browsing histories, and then she also used bought gift cards with cash so that she could avoid using credit cards. And she describes this project as an infrastructural inversion. It's another extreme case, of course, but it shows us just how far we might have to go to address the extent of our digital exposure. So from platforms to plugins and personal data interventions, we're just beginning to scratch the surface here. This serves as a kind of brief introduction to the tools and techniques that already exist to make data legible to us. And platforms are starting to change their posture towards us and taking our personal data concerns seriously. Plugins are starting to help us explore the hidden ecosystem of the data. And even at a small scale, we're actually being able to begin to intervene in our own digital profiles and experiences and learning about these systems as we go along. So we're actually learning to become fluent in digital. Legibility is the first step towards seeing clearly the data and the algorithms, and then we can start to build our vocabulary, sounding out the letters and phrases as we go. But the goal of learning to read isn't enough. Eventually, we'll need to develop even more advanced skills of interpretation. We can only comprehend and understand the digital once we develop these more advanced skills to interpret the text of our digital lives. So moving on from reading, we can try to learn the form by learning to write as well. Learning to code is a step towards claiming control over the imbalance of power in the dynamics of data. So some of us here will learn to develop these skills in statistics and mapping networks and manipulating APIs, and I think Madden will be talking about this later on in the session. But just because we can all read doesn't mean that we're all cut out to write the next great digital novel. We won't all learn to read binary, and we may not all need to learn JavaScript or Python either. But we can develop our skills in computational thinking. So as a recent Mother Jones piece argues, the greatest contribution the young programmers bring isn't the software they write, it's the way that they think. Computational thinking empowers us to interrogate the data and algorithms that govern our lives. By poking and prodding the inputs and the outputs, we're learning to reverse engineer these systems. Or at least, at the very least, we're practicing how to form hypotheses to speculate about how the data is used. The more possible theories that we explore, the closer we get to holding others accountable for the uses of our data. So I want to leave you all with a few priorities that we can all focus on to get closer to developing these critical digital literacies. So first, I think we need to demand more of the digital platforms that manage our data. We have to keep asking Facebook and Google and everyone else who handles our data to provide us with the tools to tweak our personal feeds and experiment with our own digital experiences. Right now, they're only offering us a meager vocabulary list to learn from. And we need to actually ask them to put the pieces of our data story together to actually form a real narrative that we can understand. And we also need more of these tools, like these plugins, to help us inform our choices about our digital engagement. So designers and engineers in the audience, I encourage you to all find new ways of incorporating digital literacy and legibility into the things that you build. Open up these black boxes and allow your users to play with features and filters. Make these causal connections more clear. If you have the coding skills, build tools that empower others to intervene and interpret our own data as well. And lastly, as individuals, we can all become a little more curious. Thinking critically about how that next click might influence our future experience is something important. Question these underlying premises of the default settings and the business models that support them. We don't have to take everything for granted. We can develop digital literacy just by being curious. Thanks.